Buenas tardes. Es para mí un placer poder presentarles al profesor John Haldane. Y realmente hace ahora casi 15 años tuve la oportunidad de conocerle en la Universidad de Notre Dame, en Indiana, con ocasión de estaba recién llegada allí para hacer un postdoc y él acudió a esa universidad en ese momento para participar en un Summer Domestic Institute, que organizaba el Jacques Maritain Center. Y quiero mencionar este hecho porque me parece que es algo que demuestra una característica muy propia del profesor John Haldane, conocido filósofo, muy respetado filósofo y reconocido en el ámbito anglosajón. Y esa característica es precisamente su preocupación por despertar jóvenes vocaciones para el mundo académico, para la universidad. Esos Summer Institutes tenían la finalidad de formar a jóvenes filósofos que luego pudieran desarrollarse en el mundo académico. El profesor Haldane estaba allí y me consta que muchos otros veranos dedicó mucho de su tiempo a fomentar esos cursos y participar en ellos. Es profesor de filosofía en la Universidad de St. Andrews, en Escocia. Se formó en el Birkbeck College, en el Instituto de Educación, en la Universidad de Londres. Y también es, y desde hace ya más de una decena de años, director de un centro de investigación sobre filosofía, ética y asuntos públicos en la Universidad de St. Andrews. Además de ser un reconocido filósofo, tiene varias otras facetas que, aunque sea brevemente, me gustaría mencionar. Una es sus intereses culturales y artísticos, y otra es su presencia habitual en medios de radio, televisión y prensa. Y esto, para alguien que se dedica a la ética, en otras ocasiones también a la metafísica, creo que es bastante algo de poner de relieve esta característica de querer estar en el borde de la transferencia del conocimiento también en esos campos. Bien, no quisiera alargarme más y le daría ya la palabra al profesor John Haldane. Gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure our distinguished panel have distributed themselves, our opening panel, but let me begin by saying, Rector Magnifico, Minister, Vice President, Dean Naval, estimados colegas, students, guests and others, I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak to this conference on such a significant topic at what is an important and perhaps even a critical period for higher education, both, I think, in its internal development and in its place within wider culture. It's a great pleasure for me to be returning to the University of Navarre, at which I first visited, I suppose, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and a delight to see how the university is flourishing, both as we can see around us in the development of its estate, but as also in its work in scholarship and in education. In his opening remarks, the Minister of Education spoke of the contribution of this university and of universities more generally, speaking of their economic, cultural and social role, but rightly emphasising the educational work of universities and the focus, therefore, on the needs and interests of students. And I shall be speaking about that, putting students at the heart of the university education enterprise. Perhaps I could just begin by quoting, however, from an article in yesterday's London Financial Times. In it, the author writes as follows: in the world of universities, the word brand itself has a bad brand. At best, it sounds shallow. At worst, it evokes marketing talk. Swap the brand word for reputation, and suddenly it's easier to talk about this decisive educational variable. For nobody doubts that a university's reputation, its image and perceived values, the gut reaction created by mention of its name, goes a long way to determining its prospects. Now, I'm sure that is true. I do, however, have to say that what I was quoting was not exactly correct. In fact, the author was writing about political parties, not universities. I've simply substituted the word universities where he used the word in politics, political parties, and so on. But what holds true for political parties holds true for universities and indeed for many other institutions in the contemporary world. Now, as is noted in the very useful position paper co-authored by Victor Pérez-Díaz and Juan Carlos Rodriguez, which I think has been made available to many people for the purposes of this conference, as they note in that very useful position paper, and as I am sure will be discussed in subsequent sessions in this conference, the issue of universities' reputations has been transformed by the development of international university rankings, as well as by national publicly funded teaching quality and research assessment exercises, and by independent discipline-based and institutional reviews and guides. There has been much professional discussion of the methodologies involved in these diverse modes of evaluation. But what is of greatest interest to most constituencies, or most publics, as Pérez-Díaz and Rodriguez term them, most readers, if you like, most users, namely students, academic staff, administrators and managers, public officials, potential employers, and the general public, what's of greatest interest to them are the results, not the methodologies. Apart from the issue of different criteria used in evaluations, there is the fact that the products are notoriously amenable to selective display. It's often said that the intended purposes of such reviews, surveys, and rankings is to inform potential students, employers, and funding sources. But I doubt that anyone who is not already well informed could read far into them or know what to make of the divergent rankings, the ways in which the same institution can appear quite differently in different rankings and so on. I'll mention just one example, and loyalty disposes me to choose my own institution, the University of St. Andrews. St. Andrews, San Andrea, was founded in 1413, and it's the third oldest university in the English-speaking world, following Oxford and Cambridge. It also follows them immediately behind them in the order Cambridge, Oxford, St. Andrews in the 2015 Guardian and in the Times and Sunday Times University Guides, and is placed fourth in the UK Complete University Guide league table, with the London School of Economics then placed as third. In international tables, by contrast, it's 39th in the most recent CWTS Leiden ranking, with Cambridge at 19th place and Oxford 24th. But in the QS rankings, Cambridge and Oxford appear as joint second and fifth, while St. Andrews comes in at 88th. And in the Times Higher World Rankings, Oxford is third, Cambridge is fifth, and St. Andrews is 111th, though 33rd for arts and humanities. What would it be reasonable to conclude from these results taken together? Well, two main things, I think. First, that Oxford and Cambridge are the leading UK universities, nationally and internationally. And that while St. Andrews, which is a much smaller and much poorer institution, is a very good British university, seen in world context, it lies well behind larger multi-faculty institutions. That's what somebody might conclude. These judgments, I think, would be broadly correct. But I think that to some extent, these judgments lead rather than follow the assessments. What I mean is that in guides and in rankings, there is an element of reputational a priorism, as I shall call it, based on shared assumptions about what is likely to be best. That is to say that readers bring to their study of these reputational surveys and other surveys certain antecedent assumptions about what is likely to be best, and to some extent I think these assumptions influence the rankings themselves. It's worth thinking about these assumptions because they relate to what I suggest remains the primary role of universities, and this refers me back to the Minister's opening remarks, namely the teaching of undergraduates. But I'm going to add to this the teaching of undergraduates in traditional disciplines. I'm not now concerned, not here concerned therefore, with the issue of what has come to be known as prestige bias, something that is complained about by scholars as it is said to influence appointment and publication decisions and peer reviews. Though I agree with the authors of the position paper, Perez Diaz and Rodriguez, when they write that, and I quote, "To a great extent, academic life, especially in its research dimension, has very similar characteristics to those of a reputation market, and as such it is liable, I think, to the same, I add now, I think it's liable to the same distortions and deceptions as a reputation market." I might also say that the issue of prestige bias, if that's what it is, also bears on the issue of graduate employment. And it is, for example, in my country, a long-standing, well, my country, the United Kingdom. I come from Scotland, but it's so far still part of the United Kingdom. This is a delicate and sensitive matter which I don't propose to discuss in public. It's a long-standing complaint in the United Kingdom, whether that's my country or not, of graduates of other universities, particularly civic and provincial ones, that Oxbridge students or graduates of Oxford and Cambridge benefit unfairly in securing jobs simply from having attended those universities. Whether that is unfair or not is not a matter I propose to discuss now. The source of the shared assumptions that I say go into forming an a priori view about the quality of different institutions, the source of the shared assumptions about what is likely to be best is, I think, a certain picture of the university as consisting in whole or in part of a community of scholar teachers and students gathered in recognizably scholastic surroundings, reading great works as part of the study of academic disciplines. That, I think, is the core idea that informs people's expectations and thereby, to some extent, their evaluations. It's no accident, I suggest, that however quaint this image may seem, it's one to which the universities I mentioned, Oxford, Cambridge and St Andrews, do in fact conform. And at the heart of this image and this reality is the teaching of undergraduates. The position paper cites an encyclopedia article by the American sociologist Gary Allen Fine, in which Fine distinguishes objective, functionalist and social construction accounts of reputation. And the paper then goes on to endorse a definition of reputation by another American sociologist, Ronald Burt, according to whom reputation is, and I quote, "the extent to which a person or group or organization is known to be trustworthy." Well, certainly one may take different perspectives on the idea of reputation while thinking that the status itself has a common character. But the idea of trustworthiness is, I think, perhaps too close to moralizing. And I think one might instead speak of reliability and associated value rather than of trustworthiness as such. More to the point, however, is the observation made in the position paper that reputations may be general or specific, regional or global, and perceived by one or more publics, different recipients, and the consequent question of whether these dimensions may be consolidated or reduced. This is a good question to pose. Concerning that, the authors write as follows: supposing that all or some of these reputations do exist, there remains one last question to address. that if all these aspects, components, or contents of reputation are reducible to a single dimension, or just a few dimensions, so that one could speak of the reputation of a given university, and not only about the research reputation, or the professional training reputation, or the education of elites reputation, and so on. Now, strictly speaking, that's the end of that quotation, strictly speaking, this is me speaking, strictly speaking, the attribution of reputational standing is not and could not be absolute, but is aspectual, not, as the logicians would once have said, not dictum simpliciter, but dictum secundum quid. What I mean by that is that reputation is logically always keyed to some aspect or respect. It's always reputation with regard to this or with regard to that. I don't think there is such a thing as reputation simpliciter. And there are a number of different features in respect of which a university may be well regarded. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for example, is highly rated in respect of the acquisition of new knowledge, particularly as that might be applied practically. And its undergraduate education is limited and conditioned by its overall research orientation. This character of MIT derives from concerns to turn scientific intelligence towards practice and innovation. But I suggest that it should be seen as an outgrowth, MIT and its reputation should be seen as an outgrowth of the main body of university education, which is for the sake not of research or of professional training, but for that of inducting undergraduates into the study of nature, both general and specific, and among the latter, and preeminently, human nature. Such is the basis for the distinction between the sciences and the disciplines. Now, between the sciences and the humanities, my apology. Both of these, the sciences and the humanities, consist primarily of sets of disciplines. But universities also teach and research in subjects and in studies. I'm here drawing a distinction, which I'll explain in a moment, between disciplines, subjects, and studies. And I'm going to propose the following marks of a discipline. A discipline, I suggest, is marked by three features. First, an enduring, if periodically changing, menu of questions or problems. Each discipline has a set of constitutive questions or problems. Secondly, a canon of major texts. And thirdly, a broad methodology. I'm also inclined to add a fourth feature, which is intelligibly, if not logically, related to the other three, namely that a discipline admits of genius. That within a sphere constituted as a discipline, it is possible for there to be geniuses. And certainly the cultural association of this with academic activity, with genius with academic activity, is connected to disciplines. Now, of course, there may be developments and disagreements with regard to menus, texts, and methodologies, menus of questions, great text methodologies, and so on. Some questions, for example, lead into other fields. There's also coming and going in the canon, both of authors and of texts, and methodologies likewise emerge, depart, and return. The point remains, however, that throughout the histories of disciplines, there are these three elements: a menu of questions, a canon of texts, a broad methodology. Scientific disciplines overlap with, but also are distinguishable from humanities ones, and in several ways. First, the scientific ones originate in and remain answerable to common observation and its relative experiment. Second, they seek to account for what is observed in broadly causal and material terms. And third, this I think is a very important feature, they're cumulative and progressive. In general, in a science, the latest is the best. And this is explicable by the process of observation and experiment, these serving as filters on and tests of hypotheses. Like humanities disciplines, sciences have a broad menu of questions or problems to deal with, again, subject to modification and specification, and they have, again, enduring methodologies. But the counterpart to a canon is barely historical, namely it's the latest and best integrated theory. Now, while disciplines in general are defined by their subject matter, an academic subject may not itself be a discipline, though typically an academic subject that is not a discipline will operate in a given place or time in relation to one or more humanities or sciences. Subjects emerged in the 19th century in the conscious development of educational curricula and syllabi, and they may be quite general or highly specific. Languages, literature, anthropology, geology, and hydraulics are examples, I suggest, not of disciplines, but of subjects. With studies, this is the third category, there is a further broadening out and also an overlapping of subjects and of patron disciplines. There are also weaker and more evidently interest-relative principles of gathering of content in subjects. For example, communication, cultural, environmental, family, gender, regional, and women's studies are familiar examples. And what they also suggest is the orientation of studies to practice and policy, often with a political aspect. Now, given the foundational priority of disciplines, there is a corresponding educational priority so far as grounding understanding is concerned. So I'm claiming that disciplines within the academy are foundational with regard both to subjects and to studies, and accordingly, when it comes to the question of teaching, they have a foundational role also. However far inquiries may move away from disciplines, it's disciplines that remain the life and form-giving roots of properly higher and not just tertiary education. Until relatively recently, such an education in the disciplines, was the privilege of the few. But increasingly, it's seen as the right of the many. And governments also favour mass participation in higher studies as contributing to economic and social development. Though I would say in the attempts to provide for that mass higher education, there has been a shift away from disciplines towards subjects and towards studies. Now, the justification for this kind of justification for education, higher education, in terms of its contribution to economic and social development, was first voiced, I think, in Germany in the 19th century and taken up in the United States in a movement designed to progress from colleges to universities, as from places of teaching to ones of research and development. It then became widespread in the second half of the last century, and in all its pure instances, I think it's prey to the criticism of instrumentalizing education. Such doctrines of education as to be justified in terms of economic and social development are philosophically problematic in that they overlook or set aside the idea that the value of education is intrinsic to it. In particular, coming to understand a concept or a theory or a practice constitutes one of the goods of human life, quite apart from the question as to whether or not it provides extrinsic or utilitarian benefit either to the individual or to the society. I'm not, of course, saying that those other benefits don't matter, but I am saying they're not central to the purpose of education. Now, one of the places where this sort of utilitarian justification, which led in a movement towards research and professional education as being central to the life of universities, was at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And it's interesting to read the inaugural address of Daniel Coit Gilman, the first president of the university, delivered there in 1876. Gilman was himself a graduate in geography from Yale University, and he'd returned there in his early 20s working to establish a scientific school to which he was then appointed as Professor of Geography. A decade after that, having been passed over for the Yale presidency, and after a short period as President of the University of California, he was appointed to the role of establishing and serving as President of Johns Hopkins. On the 50th anniversary of that university's foundation in 1926, Time magazine published an article referring to Coit and his inaugural address, describing him as, I quote, the father of the graduate school, the great apostle of university research. Now, there's grounds for this attribution in the text of his address itself, and I'll just quote briefly from his conclusion. Let us now, Coit says in 1876, let us now, as we draw near the close of this allotted hour, turn from details and recur to general principles. What are we aiming at in establishing Johns Hopkins University? The answer, an enduring foundation, a slow development, first local, then regional, then national influence, the most liberal promotion of all useful knowledge, the special provision of such departments as are elsewhere neglected in the country, a generous affiliation with all other institutions, avoiding interferences and engaging in no rivalry, the encouragement of research, the promotion of young men and the advancement of individual scholars who, by their excellence, will advance the sciences they pursue and the society where they dwell. He continues, no words could indicate our aim more fitly than those by which John Henry Newman expresses his idea of the university in a page burning with enthusiasm to which I delight to revert. End of quotation. Now, this invocation of Newman is unintentionally ironic and in some respects absurd. For Coit's distinctive vision and that of the advocates of German-inspired research institutes and professional schools would have been anathema to the author of what remains the greatest single work on the subject of higher education as an induction into academic disciplines. From the present perspective, what is most salient in Newman's account of the nature and value of university education is what it excludes. And in particular, he thought that it was not the business of universities to engage in research. Newman writes that, I quote, a university is a place of teaching universal knowledge. This implies that its object is, on the one hand, intellectual, not moral, and on the other, that it is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than the advancement of it. If its object were scientific and philosophical discovery, I do not see why a university should have students. Now, if this seems alien to the utilitarian spirit of its own times, the 19th century, let alone to the hyper-utilitarianism of ours, consider the observations advanced by the progressive liberal utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, 15 years later than Newman, and 9 years before Coit's inaugural. The occasion of Mill's remarks was that of his election as rector of the University of St Andrews, and his audience was the student body. Mill thought that the main purpose of a university was to cultivate wisdom in those who were capable of it. And by the way, Mill did not believe that many people were capable of wisdom. Mill drew a distinction between what he called the wise and the otherwise. That works better in English, I'm sure, but anyway. Probably untranslatable, I think.
They will.
Mill thought the main purpose of the university was to cultivate wisdom in those who were capable of it. He writes, a university is not a place of professional education. Universities are not intended to teach the knowledge required to fit men for some special mode of gaining their livelihood. Their object is not to make skillful lawyers, or physicians, or engineers, but capable and cultivated human beings. It's very right that there should be public facilities for the study of professions, but these things are no part of what every generation owes to the next, as that on which its civilization and worth will principally depend. So here we have two great figures of the 19th century, John Henry Newman and John Stuart Mill, both characterizing universities very explicitly and very deliberately in the face of counter-proposals in terms of what they should exclude. And Newman says they should exclude research, and Mill says they should exclude professional education. By the way, neither of them were opposed to those activities. Newman was not opposed to research, Mill was not opposed to professional education, but they each thought that those activities should go on in other institutions that might be housed adjacent to universities, but those activities were not the purposes of universities. As I say, Newman was not against research, but believed it should be conducted in special institutes, and Mill likewise thought that the fact that certain activities are important for individuals and for society doesn't mean they should be part of the university curriculum. Now, that was then. I don't think there's any going back to the Newman-Mill conception or conceptions, and I'm not recommending that we should, but I do think that their ways of thinking about these things have influenced more broadly our understanding of what universities are for, and I think that understanding informs and is part of what I called the a priori approach that people have to considering the standing and reputation of universities. So, wherever we may now think it apt to draw distinctions, and however widely we might let the notion of a university range, it remains possible, I think, and important to recognize the concerns of Newman and Mill, which we might follow them in expressing in terms of the distinction between knowledge and understanding. Newman in particular was concerned that as well as coming to know about the particular and the temporary, human beings need to form an understanding of the general and the permanent, especially as the general and the permanent relate to the human condition. Likewise, in thinking about universities and their reputations, we should acknowledge, I think, that a large part of what the primary publics, to use that phrase, need, and what they themselves associate with the likes, for example, of Oxford, Cambridge, St Andrews, and many other such institutions, what they associate with those is the business of cultivating minds towards the achievement of broad understanding. And this is the work of undergraduate education, and is best done through the study not of subjects or of studies, but of disciplines. To take all of that seriously requires putting students, and in particular undergraduates, at the heart of the university education enterprise. And indeed, I would say, putting students, and not scholars, at the heart of the university. In doing that, we will also have a chance of leading society rather than following it, and of securing merited approbation, and hence the reputation of being the places where rising generations are instructed in the most important kind of learning it is possible to have, namely that of the nature of the world and the place of human beings within it. Now, the evidence is that institutions that have this reputation attract well-qualified and interested students who in turn encourage others and in later years direct their own children towards the same or similar universities. Issues of research and knowledge transfer have their place, and it's a very important place. But it's for these students at least a secondary position to that of learning and of understanding what Matthew Arnold, another great 19th century thinker about university education, suggested in his Essays, Culture and Anarchy, first published in the same year as Mill's rectorial address, what he referred to as the best that has been thought and said. And I'm suggesting that the primary purpose of universities, and that around which their primary reputation will be drawn, is their role exactly in inducting rising generations into studying the best that has been thought and said. Thank you.
Thank you.